All right, we are finally ready for the last concept in the energy section, and that is on cellular respiration. And like photosynthesis, this is something we've been talking about for quite some time. So some things that we already know about cellular respiration is that, or what we should already know about cellular respiration is that it happens in the mitochondria, which we have talked about for quite some time, for the fact that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, meaning it gives us energy. So first off, the goal of cellular respiration is to convert the chemical energy in food, specifically glucose. And this can be either the food that we eat, as in our actual food, or the food that plants just made in photosynthesis, but it's still glucose either way. And we are converting this into a chemical energy stored in ATP. So what this looks like, we are going to use carbohydrates first for energy, which we've talked about, that we always want to use carbs first. But any food can be processed and broken down as a source of energy. So if you remember, we always want to use carbs. Second is our lipids and then proteins. So we want to use carbs, but we can use anything else if we have to. And just like photosynthesis, we do have to know the equation for cellular respiration also. However, it has worked out very well and convenient for you that if you know one, you know the other. And what I mean by that is, looking at our equation here, is that the two things are just flipped. So the things that were our reactants last time are now our products, and what was our products are now our reactants. So they have just switched sides. So we still have all of the same things. We have glucose, oxygen, giving us, should be an arrow here, sorry, giving us H2O and carbon dioxide. The thing that has changed previously, we had our energy being with our arrow for sunlight, but now our energy is actually on the product side. So looking at our equation, the reactants, or the ingredients of what we have, is this first portion. That is our glucose and our oxygen. So C6H12O6 and 6O2. Those are our ingredients, which happen to be our products in photosynthesis. And the products that we have, or the things that we're making, the results, are now on this side. So we have 6CO2 and 6H2O, so carbon dioxide and water. And again, with our energy, just being critical here, energy is released in the form of ATP, but again, we're not considering a product because you can't, remember our little saying, energy is neither created or destroyed, so we can't put it as a product because that would imply that we created it. So the structure of the mitochondria is very similar to that of the chloroplast, in the fact that it has these two internal structures. So the first structure of the mitochondria is the inner membrane, which is just a bunch of folded membrane. So it's this kind of worm or a snake inside of the mitochondria, and it's just another membrane that's been all folded up and packed inside. Just like in our chloroplast, the second structure is a liquid. So now we have the matrix, and this is the fluid-like substance that fills all of the open space, just like the stroma or just like cytoplasm. So in purple, we have our inner membrane, and then in the matrix portion is the fluid filling in all of the open space, which I believe you have little labels for these on your page if you want to fill those in. Okay, and for cellular respiration, we are always going to have this same first step of glycolysis. So the very first stage will always be glycolysis, which is simply the breakdown of glucose. We will see later on that step number 2 after glycolysis can be different, but we will always have the same step number 1. So the purpose of glycolysis is to split our 6-carbon molecule of glucose into 2 forms of 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. So what do I mean when I say the 6-carbon molecule of glucose? Well, if you remember our chemical equation for glucose, it is C6H12O6. So when we say a 6-carbon sugar, we mean it has 6 carbons. And so we're going to turn that 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. Why do we have to do this? It's just putting the glucose in a simpler form that your body can use easier. This step occurs in the cytoplasm, so it's actually happening outside of the mitochondria, and it requires no oxygen. So because it requires no oxygen, we call this anaerobic. So if you think if we see A at the beginning of the words, it usually means no, like we can have symmetrical and asymmetrical. Asymmetrical means not symmetrical. So same sort of thing, we have no air or no oxygen required. And in this step of glycolysis, we are producing a total of, which will be very important, 2 ATP and 2 NADPH. So we're going to want to keep a total of these as we go on throughout our steps. So as we said, step number 1 is always going to be the same thing, but step number 2 can be different depending on the scenario. So now we get to make the decision. What type of step number 2 are we going to take? So after glycolysis, the cell must make a decision on how to move forward. And if oxygen is present, then the cell will go through a 2-step process known as aerobic respiration. And again, this aerobic means with air, with oxygen to obtain energy. And if oxygen is not present, then the cell will go through the process of anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation, in order to obtain energy. So if oxygen is not present, we're doing anaerobic, so no oxygen, which is also known as fermentation. Both of these are going to give us energy. They both obtain energy, but just in different ways and in different amounts of energy. So we will always have glycolysis as step number 1. And then if oxygen is present, we will go through aerobic respiration. And if oxygen is not present, we will go through anaerobic respiration. Okay, today we are looking at when oxygen is available. So again, we call this aerobic respiration. And just like in photosynthesis, we have a chemical reaction name of what is happening. So the series of chemical reactions that we're going to go through here is called the citric acid cycle, which can also be known as the Krebs cycle. So either way, we can call it aerobic respiration, citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. And the location of this step is going to be in the mitochondrial matrix. And the matrix is the liquid filling in all the open space of the mitochondria. So what's happening here in the citric acid cycle is that we are taking the 2 pyruvate molecules from glycolysis that we just made and are going to chemically convert them into 2 ATP and some NADH and FADH. But we want to keep track of that ATP total, right? We are adding 2 more. We are also going to be releasing carbon dioxide as a waste product. So, taking the 2 pyruvate that we got in the previous step, turning it into ATP, other energy molecules, and carbon dioxide. Aerobic respiration itself is a 2-step process. So after the citric acid cycle, we're then going to go to the electron transport chain. So this is going to work just like it did in photosynthesis, but now we're inside the mitochondria. So the location now is the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and that's the little squiggly folded membrane inside. And so what's happening here is, again, it's a series of reactions, and we're using the electrons and the hydrogen that we just made in the Krebs cycle, and we're going to use those to make more ATP. So 34 ATP and water, because we're going to bind the hydrogen that we have with the water with the oxygen that we took in. And this is a really big number, 34 ATP. Most of the ATP that we make in total is coming from this step. So if you think about it, we had 2 ATP that came from glycolysis, and we had 2 ATP that came from the Krebs cycle. So 2, 2, 4, making a total of 34, or 38, sorry, when we add our 34 here. All right, after this video, you're going to continue on and to fill in the diagram of our mitochondria.